Hello and welcome. I'm Esther Schor from the Department of English at Princeton University, and I'm here with my colleague Michael Gordin from the Department of History and Historian of Science at Princeton. Michael Gordin specializes in the history of the modern physical sciences and Russian, European, and American history. He came to Princeton in 2003 after earning his A.B. and his Ph.D. from Harvard University, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the prestigious Harvard Society of Fellows. Michael Gordin writes on a wide variety of topics, including the introduction of science into Russia in the early 18th century, the history of biological warfare in the late Soviet period, and the relations between Russian literature and science. For his scholarship, he has been honored by an NEH Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship. His first book is a cultural history of Mendeleev in the context of Imperial St. Petersburg. It's called A Well-Ordered Thing, Dmitry Mendeleev and the Shadow of the Periodic Table. His second book, 5 Days in August, How World War II Became a Nuclear War, is a history of the atomic bombings of Japan during World War II, and he has also written an international history of nuclear intelligence, Red Cloud at Dawn, Truman, Stalin, and the End of the Atomic Monopoly. His book, Scientific Babble, How Science Was Done Before and After Global English, is a history of modern science from the point of view of the languages in which science has been conducted. So Michael, I'd like to start by asking you to tell us something about what motivated you to write about language and science, maybe starting with your own life in language, your own linguistic background.
Well, one of the things about language is that everybody has an incredibly intimate relationship with at least one. And that was something that I had come to realize very early. My parents are both Israeli, but I was born in the United States and raised in the US and the UK. And my brothers and I were raised entirely in English because my parents were of the view, which is now no longer fashionable, that bilingualism is a terrible thing for a child. Yeah. And they thought, what is the point of raising a child with a language that only a few million people speak when we could give them this global language that will work everywhere? Mm-hmm. So they made what I now realize was a large sacrifice of raising us in a language they felt less than comfortable in. And over time, I came to appreciate that as I started learning languages, how difficult that is and what value people give to the kind of language that can move them forward in the world. And so I learned some Hebrew as a child, and then Spanish in school, and then when I entered university, I kind of fell in love with Russian, and then from there studied Russian, German, and later on some Czech, some Latin, some French, and finally Esperanto, okay, which you knew. You and I met before I started learning that.
Over Esperanto and coffee. So I just wanted to ask them what made you want to write about language and science.
So that started when I was working on that book about the Soviet bomb, which I wrote when I was in Berlin on a year of leave. And I was at an institute for the history of science where there were lots of historians, and the place was functionally bilingual. A lot of Germans, a lot of Anglophones walking around. English was probably 75% of the conversation. But for lunch, there was no cafeteria or canteen, so we would go to this Institute for Molecular Genetics just 2 blocks away. That place ran entirely in English. There was no German to be heard, and that's because everybody there were from Mexico, from Malaysia, from Japan, from Germany, from Sweden, and English was the only language that you knew everybody would have in common, because everybody already had learned a second language. That second language just wasn't German, it was English. Yeah. So that contrast between a humanistic discipline and a scientific discipline struck me. And I'd noticed before that science mostly seems to be published in English, but I didn't quite know how much. And so I started digging and investigating, and the more I explored, the more I realized how recent the phenomenon of global English is. It really tips irreversibly around the 1960s, 1970s, and how pluralistic communication had been in the sciences beforehand.
Before that, yeah.
And that people had thought the idea that there would be one language in which most science would be conducted was absolutely a foolish idea. No one would ever agree. And the example they always pointed to about why it was foolish was Esperanto, because that was an attempt to get everybody to speak one language for communicative purposes, and it failed. And that got me excited about following that. So it was a personal experience that led me to tumble into the topic, and the topic led me naturally to Esperanto.
Well, let me ask a rather large question. It's a question you raised in your talk. And it's about whether to think about constructed languages through the framework of science or through the framework of the humanities. So I just want to ask you what difference it makes. What are the different questions that arise when we use these different frames of reference?
It's a good question. It depends what period you look. Let me answer this question the more direct way. Why do we think generally that language is something that belongs to the humanists and that humanists study and that scientists don't? Part of the reason for that is is that there are disciplines that are studying literature and they often teach language as well, so we see them as associated. And the phenomenon of global English has made it seem like language is not something that scientists need to care about, except of course for English, which in an Anglophone country like the United States is invisible. So we also, when we hear about constructed languages, we think of those in terms, usually, at least this is how my students present it, as having to do with The Lord of the Rings, Star Trek for a slightly older generation, and for the present day it has to do with Game of Thrones and Dothraki. And this is play, this is science fiction, this is language as a prop.
Right.
And so they think constructed languages are games that humanistic people like to play. And when you go into the deeper history of these languages, and there have been attempts to construct universal languages since at least the 17th century, quite active ones. The initial ones in the 17th century are about science. They are, can we make a language that represents the true state of the world so that there's no ambiguity in how we talk, there's no confusion. And they wanted to start from classifying animals and having one word for each animal, and that the words would convey a relationship. So that when you heard ostrich, penguin, and hawk, somehow the words as they were pronounced would all convey that those are birds, even though they may not look like they're related to each other when you see them. So that was a scientific project, and somehow it mutated into this prop for entertainment or play. And in the middle of there is this Esperanto period when it's kind of both at the same time. And that's part of the thing I found attractive about that period.
There are a lot of paradoxes about the initial launch of Esperanto, because it's launched as a commercial technique, you know, a way of doing business, very practical, with some poems at the back, you know, so there's a sense that one does both, one can do both. So your talk was called The Einstein Language, Finding and Losing Gloro. So we'll talk about Einstein, we'll talk about Gloro, but the talk centers on a figure named Max Talmy. So tell us a little bit about Talmy and his background.
So Max Talmy is another one of these scholarly rabbit holes. You find someone and then you want to find everything about them. So he was born named Max Talmud, that was his native language, older brother named Bernard, in a place called Taurogen or Tauroge, depending whether you're German speaking or Lithuanian speaking, on the border of the Russian Empire and the Prussian Empire. So in what today is Lithuania. I think it's today Lithuania, it might be today Poland. The borders are flexible. And he followed his brother Bernard to Munich when he was of school age, university age, to study medicine, which is what his brother had done as well. And even before he left for Germany, he found himself very attracted to questions of language. The way he put it was that he learned when he was about 6 that his native language wasn't a language, it was a dialect. He didn't specify what that was, but that's basically Yiddish.
That was Yiddish.
Yeah, that he just didn't think of Yiddish as a real language, which any linguist today would tell you is a crazy thing to say, but was quite a common view for...
It's called a jargon.
Jargon. For modernizing Jews of that period, it was seen as a demeaning language, a kind of patois that you shouldn't speak. So he learned German and Russian and other languages early, but moved to Munich to become an eye doctor. And studied there, then again followed Bernard and emigrated to the United States, where he changed his name to Talmy. And he worked as an eye doctor, especially a cataract surgeon in New York City. He lived in New York City for his entire rest of his life, until he died in the 40s. Of course, that's just the biography. That doesn't say anything about why he's interesting. One line of why he's interesting has to do with constructed languages. So
tell us about his life with Esperanto and Ido.
So he the first constructed language he encountered was Volapük, which was first published in 1879 and was all the rage for about a decade, and then collapsed under its own internal conflicts and being displaced by Esperanto. And if you show someone the two languages now, Volapük looks unbelievably Baroque and complicated compared to Esperanto, but at the time it looked easier than learning either German or English, which is most of what it's based on. It's still incredibly awkward to use. Esperanto he discovered really only after moving to the United States.
Yeah.
So he moved to the United States.
1905, 6.
5-6 is when he discovered it.
Yeah.
1903 is when he moved to the U.S. And he loved the language. He founded the New York Esperanto Society, which is still around. In fact, at the talk, there were several past presidents of the society founded by Ptolemy, which was surprising for me. And he wrote the first original English language textbook in Esperanto. The other ones were all translated from other languages, such as French or German or Russian. And it's quite a good textbook. You can still get it. You can buy it online if you would like. It's a reprint version of the original. I've used it to teach students Esperanto, and it works really well.
That's nice. I know.
It's not very long. And then he, in 1907, there's a schism within the Esperanto community. There was a decision by the International Association of Academies, which was itself quite young, 1900 organization based in Vienna, that they should pick a language in which scholarship could be done so that all of the new languages that the new self-aware national peoples were using could somehow be correlated so we wouldn't lose all this knowledge because the Romanians don't understand the Danes.
Right.
And there's a delegation put in charge of this. And the delegation has to choose between three things. One is you could use an existing language, like English, French, or German. That's considered absurd because there's no way the French will speak English and there's no way the Germans will speak French and the English. So that's considered impossible. It's ruled out of court by everybody immediately, which I find fascinating because it's what happened. The second option is to revive a so-called dead language like Latin or Greek, but they think that's impossible because we live in the 20th century and we have things like automobiles, which use internal combustion engines. Even though automobile, internal combustion, and engine are all Latin, nonetheless, they think you can't possibly use it. So then they say we have to have a constructed one. They interview all the leading proposers of these. Zamenhof, the creator of Esperanto, couldn't come, so he was represented by a man named Louis de Beaufort, who was the representative and leading evangelist for Esperanto in France. At that meeting, there's this scandal. A new grammar penned by a pseudonym named Ido, which means descendant in Esperanto, was circulated. And the committee, which has scientists and linguists and diplomats on it, says this is a better language than Esperanto. It's a reformed version of Esperanto. Right. Let's pick that. This causes a schism in the Esperanto movement. Some people leave, some people don't. Ptolemy, watching this from afar, thinks Ido's a better language, so he defects to it. So the leader of the New York Esperanto Society rejects it. So
I have here the New York Times covering this event, December 27th, 1907, with a large headline about this schism among the New York Esperantists. So Ptolemy, who had recently created the New York Esperanto Society, secedes. So what was it that attracted him to Ido? What did he think a constructed language was for? Because that's the question that emerges from the Ido schism.
Yeah, so he thinks a constructed language is for transparent communication, which means it needs to be simple, universal, and unencumbered with oddities.
Right.
This is going to become ironic a little bit later. But he also thinks that a constructed language should in itself be scientific. He himself is a doctor. He and the New York Times have a long relationship. He writes letters to the editor constantly about all sorts of scientific and medical issues.
He's not a researcher per se, but he has a lot of opinions about scientific procedures, medical procedures.
Yeah, and it's also a sign that the New York Times was really a local newspaper in this period because the local cranky doctor is able to do whatever he wants.
That's right.
So he thinks a language should be scientific in a couple of ways. It should obey regular principles that are foundational linguistic rules. And he has a sense of what those are, and they're related to what Ido wants, which is that each word should have one and only one meaning. Right. You should be able to convert from adjective to noun straightforwardly. And aspects of Esperanto like that it has an accusative. He doesn't like that. He thinks that word order should be fixed and that will solve that problem.
And the superscriptions.
And superscripts, the letters are bad, and that it should have a more rational pluralization, and that all the words should be derived from existing languages, which in Esperanto is almost true, except for the relative pronouns, which are largely made up, but effective.
Yeah.
So he takes them all from Latin, or Ito takes them all from Latin, and he likes that idea. So it's also scientific because it should evolve over time.
Yes.
That a language should adapt and change in the same way that species adapt and change, and the language is very Darwinian.
I mean, so this is a caricature of Esperanto, that
Yeah.
it refuses to change.
Right.
And in fact, it does have fundamental rules, but lexically, it's changing all the time.
Yeah.
It's expanding.
But part of the reason we think that, and that's absolutely true, is because we have a lot more time. It's only in 1905
Yes.
that the rule that the fundamental rules of Esperanto are untouchable, netouchable. When that happens, that's only 2 years before the Ito Schism.
Right.
And so people don't know that Esperanto is actually still going to be flexible.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, but the ordinary people who still want to keep using it do feel that's true.
Yeah.
But the intellectuals, so he thinks it's going to stay static. And so as Ito is going to be evolved and dynamic. The problem with this is Ito has no fixed rules, so it's evolved and dynamic. And within about a year and a half, in the Ito journal Progresso, you can't actually read any other article because everybody has innovated their language into an idiolect, into their own private language. And so it's almost like there's mutual intelligibility breaks down.
Yeah.
And one of the geniuses of constraining Esperanto to a set of fundamental rules as a base is it gives everybody a home base to touch on
Right.
and coordinate. So Ito evolves and evolves and evolves, and so it's going to be more scientific, and he thinks you should use it for scientific communication where science is understood as scholarly, not just natural sciences.
Right.
And that's what he really likes, and he thinks that Esperanto has gotten contaminated with poetry.
So why does he break with the Itists then?
Oh, he breaks with the Itists because he thinks that the Itists have become too doctrinaire. So when the Itists realize that this problem of dispersion of the language is happening, they freeze innovation. After 5 years of radical experimentation, during World War I, they say no one can mess with the language until 1920.
So there's a moratorium on change.
Yeah, and he thinks that's horrible. He still stays as an Itist. He writes the leading grammar book of Ito, which is
5 grammars.
5 grammars. Yeah, but the huge one is also he writes it in 21, so he's still publishing.
Still doing. That's interesting.
But by 23, 24, he's had it. He thinks that the language isn't dynamic anymore, and that it has certain features that he thinks are now imperfect.
Okay, so he invents
a new language, which he calls at first Arulo, which stands for like auxiliary regulatory language. It's combined out of Ito roots.
Yeah.
And then he renames it Gloro, which is obviously connotes glory to us.
Right.
But he claims it comes from glotto, from the word for word in Greek. And Gloro is very similar to Ito and very similar to Esperanto. If you know Esperanto, you can read Gloro.
read it, yeah.
It has some changes basically to make it more speakable. He fixes certain things to make it sound more naturalistic.
or euphony. So why do you call it the Einstein language?
Oh, so why do I call it the Einstein language? When you rewind, when he decides he's going to make a scientific language, he decides he needs to get scientists to endorse it. And so in the 1920s, he goes to a scientist who's visiting New York and tries to get him to endorse his language. That scientist is Albert Einstein.
Okay.
And Einstein meets him, talks to him extensively over several weeks. They maintain a correspondence. He never endorses the language. And you might think to yourself, why is Einstein, who since 1919 is the most famous person on the planet, more famous than Charlie Chaplin, huge figure, why does he care about this Max Talmy? If you rewind back to when Talmy was in Munich as Max Talbot as a medical student, he met 11-year-old Albert Einstein because he would go to the Einstein household to have dinner every Thursday, which was a kind of charity, a secularized Jewish tradition that his parents, Einstein's parents, did.
Yeah.
We were supposed to have a rabbinical student over for Sabbath dinner, but instead they had a medical student over for Thursdays. Max Talmy is about 11 years older than Einstein, but they hit it off. And he starts giving the young boy books to read, popular science books. There's books by Bernstein, which are a survey of popular science. There's the Kraft und Stoff, which is this book, Matter and Force and Matter, which was really popular materialist tract. And Einstein reads these books, decides he's done with religion, actually, at this time, in part for reading these books. And they work through Euclid together, they read Kant together, they have a very tight bond. And Ptolemy would visit Einstein periodically after that. But so, in a sense, Einstein and Ptolemy were linked together already.
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
Ptolemy, in the 30s, to help propagandize Gloro in part, writes a book called The Relativity Theory Simplified, which is one of the best popularizations of relativity available at the time, with an appendix, which is why it sold at all, about what Einstein was like as a boy. And so there's a link between the language and the man and the sense of conception that's all through this strange figure of Ptolemy.
So Ptolemy's claim is that Gloro is ideally suited to explain to the public.
Yes.
So on the one sense, he's claiming that Gloro is there to do science, but he's really actually using it to explain science.
To explain science, but also to change how people think. He believes that part of the reason relativity is hard to understand is that things like curved space-time and 4 dimensions are hard for people raised in these historic, encumbered languages to grasp.
Okay.
And if you spoke Gloro from an early age, you wouldn't have those hang-ups. You wouldn't have these false, fossilized conceptions of space and time.
So it's about actually raising people in Gloro so that they will...
Yeah, not necessarily as a native language, but raising them in Gloro so that they learn a lot of the science
for
through
learning science.
And so that way you don't learn, oh, it's a particle and a wave, but it's not actually a particle or a wave, it's kind of both and neither. Instead of that, you'll just have new words that convey the actual concept. And you can do that through Gloro, he thinks, more systematically.
So we need to wrap up in a moment or two, but I'd love to know what the fate of Gloro was.
So the fate of Gloro is not very pretty. As with all of these schismatic movements, Esperanto continues to, under terrible conditions, continues to grow and have supporters and revive. Edo shrinks, and Gloro never has more than a handful of people. He has one correspondent, a physician in Scranton, Pennsylvania, that he writes to in Gloro back and forth.
Yeah.
He tries to start a Gloro Society of America, which 2 people express interest in, one of whom becomes the code breaker who cracks the Soviet cables from World War II. But that's just a weird side effect.
Yeah.
And he ends up dying in the early 1940s with no one really to adhere to this language.
So ironically, it becomes almost a private language for 2 people.
Yeah, there's an old joke that people used to say about Esperanto, that it's the universal language, and oh really, how do you know? It's because nobody speaks it. And the thing is, that's not true for Esperanto, but it is kind of true for Gloro.
Yeah. Well, before we finish, I know that you and our colleague Joshua Katz have taught a course on imagined languages.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you'd say a little bit about that. And you've already told us your students came into it thinking that these were a game.
Yeah.
So what do they emerge with?
So we wanted them to juxtapose a whole bunch of fringe phenomena in languages. So one of them are these international languages like Esperanto, and then the science fiction languages like Klingon.
Yeah.
But also, are computer languages? Do dolphins and whale song, is that a language or not? What about Proto-Indo-European, a language which has never been attested but that we have reconstructed?
Yeah.
Or revived Hebrew and revived Welsh?
Right.
Like, are these, or Cornish is an even better example, what do these have in common and what do they have that are different? And so what they end up leaving the class with is they come in thinking they know what language is and that they know what a language is, that they can say, I know what English is and I know what French is, and they leave the class knowing neither of those things. So we've raised them to a higher level of confusion, but they do, I think, leave thinking about language differently as a massively complicated historical and intellectual problem, but one that's really endlessly fascinating.
And I know the course has been a huge success, and I hope you'll be teaching it again.
I hope so too.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Michael Gordin, for talking with us today.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking with you.
My pleasure.